Recording.
Cool. All right. Well, let's get started then. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is the September 2020 general meeting of Our Revolution Arlington. For those of you who have not been to a meeting of ours, I would like to just let you know that we came out. Our origin story is that we started after the 2016 campaign of Senator Bernard Sanders, and ever since then we've been doing local organizing here in Arlington and at the state level in Virginia. We are not aligned with any particular party. We are an issues-focused group, so we will work with anyone who aligns with us on any given issue. If you would like to become a member, if you aren't a member yet, you can go to our website, which is ourrevolutionarlington.us, and you can find you can click there on the membership button on our page, and also follow us on social media if you're not already doing that at OR Arlington. Tonight we're going to have a featured guest speaker, Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill is a scholar, labor activist, a syndicated columnist, and right now I think sorry, I might not be getting all the details of the biography yet, so I think Bill will correct me when he has time to speak, but he's the editor now of Global African Worker. And we invited Bill based on an essay we saw that he'd written recently in Monthly Review that was looking at the history of the U.S. As a racial capitalist state, as a settler state, and what that's kind of meant in terms of trying to build solidarity amongst groups and workers in particular, and what it's meant for labor organizing. And I thought that this would be kind of an important talk to have because right now with the racial justice protests going on, there's been a lot of talk about the U.S. as a white supremacist state, but not necessarily a lot of talk about, what are the origins of that? How does it link to, to capitalism as a system, and how does it relate to, labor markets and the way they have sorted out us into different classes and races. So I guess without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bill, and he's going to kind of give us lead us in a kind of discussion on this, and I think we'll open it up for questions afterwards. So, Bill.
Thank you, Tim. And how long do you want me to talk before we open up for questions? What's ideal?
It's fine. I know that you have, if I remember correctly, you have another engagement later on. Just whatever works for you in terms of your time frame. We have until 8, let's say.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That's fine. So I want to thank you all for inviting me very much to speak with you. And I generally am someone that likes more the Q&A and the discussion period than presenting. For a whole host of reasons, but I'm going to try to outline some points and then open it up. And I want to start with something I'm going to draw from what Tim was just saying. One of the things that's frequently said about the United States is that the original sin of the United States was slavery. And what I think is important for us to understand, both historically as well as in terms of our current reality, is that that's half true. Slavery was absolutely an original sin, but the other part of this was what was done to the indigenous. That is, the whole assumption that this land was open and available for settlers, and that the settlers could construct something, is really central to the development of the United States as we know it. And this issue of settlerism permeates a lot of different movements. And so I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of the development of the labor movement in the United States and why it has gone in certain peculiar directions. So let me just say, I wasn't going to say this originally, but let me just say a little bit about this issue of the settler state. The assumption by the Europeans that they could come here, and I'm talking about the English, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, et cetera, but in different ways, they had different plans. But the assumption that they could come and establish a particular territory was connected to this notion of the development of a particular kind of state in order to oversee the development of a settler colony. Now, for the British, the basis for this, or the prototype, was what they did in Ireland, beginning in the 1500s, and the establishment of a settler state in Ireland where the settlers were poor people from England, Wales, and Scotland who were brought over to Ireland, given the best land, and the indigenous Irish were driven largely south into worse land, were denied the use of their language, denied the best jobs, a whole series of things. So the prototype was there, but the other thing that was important about Ireland, which Theodore Allen discusses in his 2-volume work, The Invention of the White Race, is that the English didn't simply conquer Ireland. They began a total subjugation of Ireland that included the establishment or the construction of a way of thinking about the indigenous Irish that was defined explicitly as one of race. So there was a settler colony connected to the construction of race, and the indigenous Irish were considered by the English to be an inferior race. Now, the English didn't mean this in descriptive terms, which is a point that I really want to emphasize, because throughout European history, there were various kinds of descriptions of various populations as being races. There were prejudices, biases, etc. But the English meant something very explicit. They really did mean that the indigenous Irish were inferior. And this led to the construction of what came to be known as anti-Irish racism. Now, as an African-American going to Ireland, which I did in 1988, I found it absolutely fascinating to be confronted with all these white people who were talking about racism against the Irish. Now, they meant something very different than the discrimination that Irish immigrants to the United States faced in the 1800s. They weren't talking about discrimination. They were talking explicitly about a racial construction that the English put into place with a differential in treatment between the indigenous Irish and the loyalists or the British, with the idea that was propagated ideologically, in ideology of the inferiority of a people. The English bring that ideology and practice to the 13 colonies in 1607, and as they spread out, the construction of race was directly connected to this notion of a settler colony. The English, as opposed to the Spanish and the Portuguese, had no particular interest in the establishment of any kind of mestizo group, any kind of mulatto group. They were interested in removing the indigenous by any means necessary and pushing them out. And even when the forced labor that was brought over from Europe or Africa united against abysmal conditions, they sometimes united under, I guess you would describe it as sort of not entirely progressive objectives. So Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 is started largely with a revolt against the British restrictions on further expansion of the colonists into Indian territory. Now, the revolt evolves into something more complex, but this emerges again 100 years later. In 1763, the English established the Proclamation of 1763 that restricts the colonists from 13 colonies in moving further west than the Appalachian Mountains. This becomes central to the War of Independence. In fact, it's something that is cited in the Declaration that the British restriction on the further colonization of the rest of North America was viewed as an act of oppression. And so the settler state aims to expand further west and to remove the indigenous population. Now, what does this have to do with organized labor? The question of a labor movement and a labor movement's history is all too often contextualized as being the history of white labor. I would argue that the labor movement in North America starts after 1607. It starts after the colonization when the elite brings over forced labor from Europe and from Africa, and also attempts to enslave the Indians. And that they immediately create a labor contradiction, or a contradiction between, in effect, labor and capital. And the laboring classes, which included the people that were working in the fields, the people that were working in building ships, etc., periodically revolt in the 1600s against these horrendous conditions. And what's interesting and noteworthy is that these revolts were, up until the very late 1600s, included European and African indentured servants and sometimes African slaves, because most of the Africans that were initially brought over were forced to come here, but they were turned into indentured servants. It's only in the late 1600s that they become racial slaves for life. So you have these revolts that are taking place in the 1600s against horrendous conditions. In that situation, the English introduce racial oppression through the slow but systematic evolution towards what they had established in Ireland with the construction of race. And in the case of the 13 colonies, they do that on the basis of color. The idea of the one drop rule, the one drop of African blood makes you black, and therefore you can be enslaved. And the evolution of who it is that's defined as white takes place. I would argue then that the labor movement was really the sum total of these acts of resistance and organization among laboring classes from the very beginning. The trade union movement, however, doesn't emerge until the 1830s. So I'm distinguishing a labor movement as being the movement of working people that are fighting using different mechanisms, slave insurrections, guilds, sabotage, etc., from the trade union movement, which becomes more identifiable in 1830s and 1840s, arising during the period called the Jacksonian democracy, which is an oxymoron. So these different acts of rebellion by the 1700s are by and large split into rebellions that take place among the white indentured servants and rebellions that take place among the African slaves. So early on, you can see a wedge that's driven in the laboring classes. Now, let me just mention a side note, which I often find quite interesting, because I mentioned before the question of who gets defined as white. And who gets defined as white evolves throughout the history of the United States. Many of the people who currently would be defined as white are not necessarily defined as white in the 1790s and certainly in the 1600s and 1700s. And one of the populations that was not defined as white were the Irish. So in 1741, there's a conspiracy in the New York colony towards an insurrection. And the conspiracy engaged African slaves and Irish indentured servants. And they were going to join together to carry out an insurrection. The conspiracy is somehow discovered, and the rebels are arrested, and before they are executed, they're interrogated. And one of the questions that was asked of the groups was, what was the objective of the insurrection? So they asked the Africans, and the Africans say, to kill all the white people. Well, there's no particular surprise there. And then they asked the Irish, what was the objective of the uprising? And they said to kill all the white people. And what's so phenomenal about this was that the Irish identified white, not in terms of skin color and in terms of the way they looked, but they looked at white as being a social, essentially what we would now call a social construct. It identified who was the dominant group, and they weren't part of it. So what were the Irish then? They obviously weren't Africans. They don't become slaves. What were they? They were, I had generally described them as living in a racial twilight zone. But there's some people that have used a better term, I think, which is they call it probationary whiteness. And I think that that's a wonderful term because it brings to mind what it means to start when you're working somewhere and you're on probation. And you have to prove that you're good enough for the employer to keep you. And in effect, what colonial America and the United States did with various European populations was to say to you, no, unless you're English, Scottish, Welsh, Nordic, German, or French, you're not automatically white. You've got to prove it. And thus, different European populations have, over the course of time, had in various ways had to prove that they deserve to be considered white. This was true not only in the United States. You saw the same phenomenon in South Africa and Australia and New Zealand, where poor, desperately poor Europeans go, but have to prove that they're worthy of being white. And part of proving that is to actively engage in white supremacy, or at least turn a blind eye to it, either actively through settling land and helping to kill off the indigenous, or to turn a blind eye when it's happening. So the settler state becomes a state that is a white bloc, where the dominant elite establishes whiteness as a uniform, primarily to guarantee social control over laboring classes. The organized trade union movement in the United States begins in that context. It begins in the 1830s, 1840s as a white movement. It is male and female, although largely segregated gender-wise, but it begins as a white movement, and a white movement that from its inception is divided on the question of slavery. And it divided three ways: those that supported slavery, those that opposed it, and those that said it wasn't a labor issue. And those three divisions have come down to us to this day in terms of the attitude within organized labor towards issues of racism and racist oppression. The trade union movement is beginning at a point when the principal identity of the United States is that of a white republic. So you have a trade union movement, which is white, that identifies with this white republic. It does not identify as in opposition to the white republic. It does not identify as a movement of the class and of all laboring people. It identifies as a movement of white people, white working people. So that after the Civil War, the elimination of slavery in the Confederacy, there is this dilemma that faces this white organized labor, which is, well, are they white or should they really be organized labor? They couldn't really make up their mind. There was a very deep division that continued to exist. So in the 1860s, the First Labor Federation, the National Labor Union, refused to admit African Americans and Chinese. Nevertheless, and quite ironically, they wanted the African Americans to abandon the Republican Party and join with them in the formation of a Labor Party. I have found generally African Americans are not stupid. So if you're going to say to us, we can't be in your labor federation, but you should abandon the Republican Party, which was advancing Reconstruction, and join with us in this abstract idea of a Labor Party, it's like basically people said, go to hell. And so nothing was able to happen at that point. Nevertheless, there was independent organizing within the Black working class that takes place in the 1860s. In the Reconstruction South, then there's the formation of what was called the Colored National Labor Union, which was a federation. There is, by the 1870s, organizing by the Knights of Labor that included Black workers, particularly in the South, but did not include Chinese, and included some Mexican Americans. You then, as we're approaching the end of the 19th century, you start to see independent Mexican labor organizations in the Southwest, some mixed organizations racially. When the United States seizes Hawaii, shortly thereafter, labor movements develop in Hawaii, and they're organized, at least initially, on ethnic lines. You have like a Philippine labor federation, and you have a Japanese labor federation, et cetera. In California in the early 1900s, there was the famous, although many people don't know about it, but I would call it famous, Japanese Mexican Labor Association, which was just that. It was Japanese immigrants and Mexicans and Mexican Americans who formed this one overall federation and actually carried out a number of strikes in California that were successful. At a certain point, they applied to the American Federation of Labor for admission. They want to become an affiliate. Samuel Gomper's either writes or commissions a response to their request that basically says it's addressed to the Mexicans. And it says, get rid of the Japanese and we'll let you in. And I always say that when I become the president of the AFL-CIO, that what I'm going to do is make sure in the entrance that the letter that was written by the Japanese Mexican Labor Association to Samuel Gompers will be up there in big letters. It's this incredibly eloquent document. If it had been written by a New Yorker, it would have said something like, Gompers, you can go kiss my, right? But they were much more eloquent than that. But that was the gist of it. It was really remarkable. My point here is that the trade union movement is not something that was white workers and then appended to that were these other peoples. It was these different movements that are taking place, running sometimes on parallel tracks, at other points overlapping, and then at other points separating, and then coming back and forth. And so the labor movement is part of the struggle in the US trade union movement has been one of identity. Whose movement is it? And is it basically a white movement to which the rest of us are being invited? Or is it actually a movement that truly is a multiracial, multinational working class movement that has these different currents? So I would argue the latter case. And I would argue that it's critically important that we embrace the latter framework because it both recognizes the contributions of these different segments of the working class. It decenters the white worker and includes other populations, but it also helps us to understand the centrality of race and racist oppression as a dilemma facing the US working class from its inception. And it's a dilemma that the working class can't walk around. Well, what are some of the implications of this analysis? And then I want to open this up for a discussion. So I would identify these points. One, organized labor's inability to come to grips with right-wing populism is directly related to its ambivalence on race and settlers. right-wing populism, a phenomenon which I call the herpes of capitalism, has a long history in the United States, and it particularly surfaces in times of economic distress. Central to right-wing populism is intense racism, misogynism, and xenophobia. But the dominant image for right-wing populism is the notion of the US as a white republic. And to the extent that the US trade union movement has not come to grips with the problems of that framework, it has difficulty confronting right-wing populism, because the idea of the white republic ends up frequently being linked to patriotism. And that's what we see right now, by the way, as a side note, with Trump's announcement last week or the week before that there will be no more anti-racist education in the federal system, and that these discussions of white privilege and other things are going to stop because, what does he say? It's anti-American. And to the extent that the trade union movement has not come to grips with that, it doesn't know how to respond to right-wing populism. Second, the narrative of progress that we often are given is one of the narrative of the struggle of the white worker. So, the way that US history is frequently taught is that it's sort of this linear progress, that, things have always gotten better, and that, we've had our difficulties, but things keep getting better. Well, first of all, that's not true. It's never been true historically. But the other thing is that it centers that discussion on what's happened to the white worker, and it ignores the Chicano worker, the African-American worker, the indigenous worker, and others. So we've got to break with that narrative. Third point, a renaissance of labor must mean the inclusion of the larger working class and its struggles. So that means several things. It means recognizing this incredible history that I'm talking about. But it also means recognizing that there's forms of working class organization that have been and continue to be operating that don't fall easily within the construct of trade unions. I'm thinking about worker centers. I'm thinking about what's been described as poor workers unions, alt labor. There's a number of different forms of labor organization that are often situated ethnically or racially, that are nevertheless, I would argue, part of the larger labor movement and need to be engaged if there's going to be a renaissance. Final point, labor should have no interest in the notion of a white republic. Labor needs to repudiate the notion of the US as a white republic. It needs to repudiate that that is ever the construct we should have been operating on. There was a very famous trade unionist in the 1800s, early 1900s, named Andrew, I always mess up his last name, Firth, from the International Seamen's Union. And one of the interesting things about this guy is that you could read some of his work and he would sound like a Marxist with a class analysis and everything. And then so you turn the page and he goes in this whole anti-Asian rant and talking about the yellow peril and the need to protect white people. And so the notion of class struggle is not necessarily antithetical to racial supremacy. That depending on how you understand class struggle, you can be advancing class struggle and at the same time advancing white supremacy. And it's history, not just in the United States. Anyone familiar with the history of the Nazi Party may recognize the name the Strasser brothers, Otto and Gregor, who were the so-called left wing of the Nazi Party and basically articulated a notion of the need for a national revolution in Germany, a working class revolution in Germany, but nevertheless an anti-Semitic revolution. So you can, those two things are not necessarily incompatible. And that is one of the reasons that we have to be actively repudiating that entire construct. And that's where I'll end and we can open up for discussion.
Great, thank you so much. That was amazing. That was an amazing kind of trip through our history and the history of races, the kind of intertwining factors of race and class and U.S. labor history and U.S. history in general. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll open it up. Is there do we have a first question?
Tim, you going to call on people?
Yeah, I have a question. So this isn't like a well-formed question, but because it's really fascinating, you brought up so many interesting points. And I was wondering, like, we're talking about the United States as a kind of a white settler republic. And you talk about slavery as the original sin in the United States.
Slavery and
indigenous,
that's right.
All the terrible things that were done to the indigenous population. Can you, and then you talked about the effect on the labor movement and that kind of thing. Could you compare like what happened in the United States vis-a-vis the labor movement with a place that's more homogenous and didn't have slavery and didn't have that kind of thing? Like, I'm not sure what a country to compare it to would be, but I was just curious if you could contrast that.
Well, Dan, it's a very interesting question. And by the way, Allison, I saw your hand, so I'm going to call you next. My apologies. It's an interesting question, Dan, because over the last several years, the term racial capitalism has become more popular. And the late Manny Marable would use it a lot. And I've used it a lot. And part of the reason it was raised was to talk about the particularities of US capitalism. But I've sort of stopped using the term, in part because I can't find any capitalism that's not racial. And you can find, let's just take France for a second. So if you look at the French labor movement, yes, for a while it was so-called homogenous, to the extent that you're talking about the merger of the different groups within what we knew as France. But when France becomes a colonial power, this changes everything. And so the construction of France as a colonial power is a racial and capitalist project. And what happens to the French working class is that over time it becomes more diverse. And many of the leaders of the French working class, I'm going to call them white, don't know how to deal with this. And look at for example, the Algerians and other North Africans or the West Africans as aliens. So I would say, first of all, that capitalism is a racial system, but that settler capitalism or settler colonialism has certain unique features, which you can see in the United States, Israel, South Africa, Australia, and Canada. And what's important about those features is the notion of the elimination and or neutralization of the indigenous population and the construction of a state within which there's often a role for the working class, to the extent to which the settler working class unites with the settler bourgeoisie against the indigenous. The Histadrut in Palestine before Israel was set up, and then after Israel was set up, which is the Labor Federation, is an example of that. In South Africa, there was a very famous miners' strike in 1922 when the slogan was "Workers of the World Unite and Defend a White South Africa." The Australian labor movement, etc. There's plenty of examples where you have a labor movement of the settlers. And that's why I was saying before that the notion of an advocacy around class struggle is not automatically anti-white supremacist or anti-settler. It can be, but it's not necessarily, because as we see in Palestine and later in Israel, the labor forces there may have been advocating very progressive reforms, social legislation, but to the exclusion of the Palestinians, and on the condition of continuing the occupation of Palestinian territories and keeping the Palestinian citizens of Israel in a secondary place. So that becomes a contradiction in settler states. It's a long answer, forgive me.
Thank you.
Allison.
Thank you. This has been a really, really wonderful discussion. I have two questions, if it's okay, one of which I think is very short, but can you help me understand what term you would call the economic structure here before you see it being called capitalism?
I think it's always been capitalist.
Okay.
I think that was one of the unique things about the construction of the 13 colonies, that it was a capitalist colony of a developing capitalist state, developing capitalist state being England, and that was different from the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies that were further behind England in the development of capitalism, and where there was more of a mixture of feudalism and capitalism.
Thank you. And I was reading recently about racist policies that were put in place. Take, for example, the early forms of Social Security, for example, that were denied to people who were doing domestic work or farm laborers. And that was all along race lines and things like that. And I guess I'm curious, how does that fit in historically into the overview that you gave us? And does it contribute some structural reasons for the racial divide in labor?
That's a really good question. So in the 1930s, when the New Deal is pushed through, in order for the New Deal to be pushed through, Roosevelt made certain compromises. And one of the compromises was with the Southern Democrats, people who would now be Republicans, but at that time were Democrats. And the Southern Democrats and Southwestern Republicans and Democrats did not want the various benefits of the New Deal made available to African Americans in the South and Chicanos and Indians in the Southwest. So there were, when it came to labor law, which is part of what you're talking about, what it meant with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 is that agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded from protection. And what's significant about that is that this was excluding a huge number of African American and Mexican labor. Now, why was that done? I think that there were many reasons. even though the National Labor Relations Act, I would argue, was a victory, it was a uneven victory. And what the Southern and Southwestern elites understood better than many was that the organization of unions would not necessarily stop at wages, hours, and working conditions. That building organizations among workers could, and ultimately did, have an impact on other issues that people took up. So one of the things that you find is that in the South and the Southwest, unionized white workers are almost always more progressive than non-union white workers as a whole. And the Southern and Southwestern elites realized this, and they wanted to block that. So that's part of what you're talking about. Another thing that happens during the Depression in the South was that there were certain jobs that were delineated as so-called Negro jobs. And so they were jobs that Black people could hold. When the economy plummets, what was happening in many cases is that Black workers ended up being pushed out of these jobs. The jobs were given to whites, but the whites would be taking those jobs at the same wages that the Black workers had had. So what you end up having was the Black workers served as a sort of relative cushion for the white workers, but a relative cushion because they were losing out too. They were losing their jobs, and they had to take the jobs at the same rate that Black workers had had. But we existed as a cushion. Now, organized labor, depending on whether, to a great extent, whether the movement was led by leftists or not, was ambivalent about how to take up racism within the workplace. So there were unions like the United Steelworkers that would organize steel mills where there was rampant racial segregation. The African Americans and the Chicanos were frequently in the most dangerous, low-paid jobs. And they would organize the steel mills, and the living standard for everybody would rise. But what the Steelworkers Union did not tackle was the continued racial differentiation. So you would have an improvement in the living standard for the African American and Chicano workers, but they still were underneath the white workers. The Steelworkers leadership, by and large, did not want to tackle racial discrimination. They were afraid that that was going to antagonize the white workers. That can be contrasted with the experience of unions like the packing house workers, the United Electrical Workers, and some others that were led by leftists, where they actively tackled racial discrimination. And the packing house workers particularly, which included tackling the hiring practices of packing house companies, racially discriminatory. So depending on what part of the labor movement you were in, some parts of labor actually took on issues of race, recognizing that that's how you're going to build unity. And others, for fear that it was going to be divisive, they just turned a blind eye. And the steelworkers paid a very bad price for that, leading into the 1970s, in terms of divisions within their ranks. Miguel, you have a question here. I'd rather you say it because I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're getting at.
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you were saying before, and thank you. This has been fascinating. I'm thinking about some of the tensions that we see now, right? The kind of protectionist, anti-immigrant. You were talking about the kind of fear of the yellow peril. The need to, at least the stated need to protect wages and protect their labor groups from being undercut in kind of wage pressure by incoming groups who can work at much cheaper rates. How much of that is kind of related to racism or how is that intertwined in kind of the bigger picture of racism?
Oh, it's very intertwined. I mean, when we should be clear, when we talk about, for example, the immigration crisis in the United States, there is no immigration crisis. There's a crisis of immigration from the global South. Nobody, to my knowledge, is complaining about undocumented Irish, Russians, or Ukrainians coming here. When Trump would talk about, what was that term? Anchor babies, right? The reference to anchor babies of women coming over here to have children that would have US citizenship. The focal point has always been on women from the global South, from Asia or from Latin America. Yet there's an entire industry of women from Russia and Ukraine going to Florida. In fact, there's at least one hotel that has a business there for these women to come there in order to have their children and then to return to Russia or Ukraine with dual citizenship. And I have not yet heard Trump or any of these other suckers talk about that. So there is no immigration problem. The problem is immigrants from the global South. And you know, when Trump's campaign started in 2015, he talked about Mexicans bringing crime. Now, this was phenomenal, leaving aside that he really wasn't just talking about Mexicans, he was talking about all Latinos and Latinas. Let's just leave that aside for a second. What's true about the United States is that every immigrant population to the United States has either brought or fostered a criminal organization. You ever hear the Cosa Nostra, right? They didn't start in El Salvador, right? Nor did they start in Nairobi. And so, you know, or talk about the Irish mob, right? Or the Jewish mob. I mean, you go on and on. And these criminal groups come and they first pick on, they're parasites on their own people, and then they expand outward. So when he was talking about Mexicans, it's like, wow, this is interesting. So why isn't he talking about the most dangerous criminal organization in the United States? The one that law enforcement fears the most, the Russian mafia. Not once did he talk about that. And I don't remember any labor leader ever standing up and saying, Mr. Trump, why don't we start talking about the Russians? We want to talk about crime. Let's talk about the Russians. I don't remember that. And see, if you don't talk about the way that this plays out, it ends up sounding very moralistic. In other words, if you're not talking, if you're basically saying, well, we need to treat all immigrants well. Well, of course, I'm no sucker, right? But when we have opportunists playing the race card with immigration and talking about Mexicans, Filipinos, Haitians, etc., but completely ignoring Irish, Ukrainians, Russians, etc., that's what we got to get at. Why this differential? What's the real issue? Organized labor has been very mixed about this. You know, in the 1800s, certainly it was a case that immigrants like from Ireland and from Italy and Sicily faced all kinds of discrimination when they got here. That's true. But within a generation, they became white people. And while there was antipathy to many of these immigrants, there was nothing comparable to the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was nothing comparable to the so-called gentleman's agreement that excluded Japanese from becoming citizens of the United States. There was nothing comparable. Now, Miguel, as a final point on this, you know, actually, there's a final 2 points about this issue of immigration. So one point, I gave a lecture once and this Italian guy came up to me and he said, Bill, this was like really great. And he said, you know, when my ancestors came here from Sicily, they went to Ellis Island. And on their immigration status, where it said race, it was stamped dark. And I said, holy shit, does that not summarize the problem between Italians and African Americans? Right? Because the Italians, and particularly the Sicilians, were a suspect race as far as the immigration authorities were. These were suspect people. Why? Because all these North Africans had basically polluted the Sicilian and Southern Italian gene pool. And you look at Sicilians and some, like, are they really Algerians or from Palermo, right? And it's like, this was driving people crazy. So how do you prove you're white? By being the most white supremacist, the adamant against African Americans and other populations. And it just all came together. Here's the other thing about immigration that I love. I mean, you can't make this shit up. It's really amazing. I did a training once, and this white guy came into the training, and everyone was introducing themselves. You know, the name, where they're from, what union local they were in. And this guy says, gives his name and says, and my ancestors came here legally. And he was just like strutting like a peacock, right? And I knew exactly what was going on with this character, right? Now, what's really funny about this is the year 1924. Now, this is something you can do this at home, as they say, right? The next time you hear someone say, my ancestors came here legally, ask them, when did your ancestors come here? Now, if they came before the year 1924, let me tell you what the criteria was for entry. You could not be Chinese, you could not be insane, and you could not be infirm. That's it. So all these people that strut around saying, my ancestors came here legally, well, of course. So why don't we apply 2/3 of those criteria to current immigrants? I mean, shit, if it was good enough for the Italians in 1910, why can't it be good enough for the Salvadorans today? I mean, if the criteria is you can't be infirm, you can't be insane, well, then what the hell? And that is when you get them. It's like zing, right? And you see the way that this has played itself out. Now, that act, by the way, in 1924 was an act that was pushed by the KKK very successfully, I might add. The Johnson something act, you have to look it up, that put these restrictions. And here's the postscript to it. As a result of these restrictions, all of these Southern and East Europeans that came here, all of a sudden became undocumented if they didn't already have their citizenship until World War II. So you had all these Italians and Jews running around that weren't documented, which also helps to explain why when Hitler was beginning the Holocaust, they wouldn't let the Jews in. I'm gonna have to run in a minute. So let's see, are there other questions? Any final questions before I run?
So I don't know if you have time to answer this, Bill, but I was kind of wondering, you kind of mentioned just, I guess maybe this touches somewhat on the immigration issue, but just the role, I guess, that the labor has historically played in kind of supporting U.S. imperialism, which I think, as you kind of identified in your essay, has been a major kind of push factor if you're looking for why people are coming to the U.S. I mean, there's a draw, but there's also a push. You know, we've rendered a lot of those countries largely uninhabitable, and it just seems like the labor movement has been kind of, historically, it's just not really played like a large role in preventing, the U.S. from running amok abroad.
Organized labor, white organized labor has, to my knowledge, never taken a stand against manifest destiny. So while Indians were being slaughtered in the West, I've never seen any documentation that became an issue that the white labor movement was particularly concerned about. The Spanish-American War is one exception where organized labor, including Samuel Gompers, were vehemently opposed to the war. But with that as an exception, one of the things about the bulk of organized labor is that it has felt that it has to prove its patriotism, its loyalty, which I think is related to the notion of the White Republic, by supporting US foreign policy, supporting wars like World War I, being silent on interventions like the invasion of Haiti and the Dominican Republic in the teens. And then going worse than that after World War II in actively collaborating with the US state in the suppression of various labor movements, including the left-wing led Japanese labor movement, which was suppressed with a combination of the Yakuza and the CIA, or the OSS first. The collaboration with the Corsican Mafia in the destruction of left-wing French unions in southern France after World War II. The involvement in coups, such as British Guiana in 1964 and Chile in 1973. And the terrible role that the majority of organized labor played during the Central American Wars. I say the majority because a split developed in the 1980s when several unions, including the United Auto Workers, SEIU, and some others, took a different path when it came to the Central American Wars. I believe that part of this is about white identity, identifying with the white republic, and part of it is the notion that because labor, organized labor, has always been treated in the United States as a rebellious movement and that is subject to repression, the leaders of organized labor have repeatedly attempted to prove their loyalty. That we really, we may be raising hell and going on strikes, but we really are true Americans. And the way that we will show that is by supporting the westward expansion, supporting the coup against Allende, or whatever the case may be. And it's been uneven. That doesn't mean all of organized labor has done that. Some segments of organized labor have consistently opposed US imperial adventures. So it's not painting with one brush, but it does mean we've got to pay attention to that, which leads to the final point that you were raising about immigration. There's a great slogan that came out of the British immigrant rights movement of the 1980s, which was, "We are here because you were there." And I've always thought that was like, that really sums it up, right? If you want to understand why before 1979, most of us probably never ran across someone from El Salvador. And then within a few years, you'd run across entire villages here in the United States. It's because of the role that the United States played in the Salvadoran Civil War. If you want to understand Guatemalans coming here, you've got to understand the race war that the United States supported against the Mayans. So people have come here, and it's one of the things that drives me crazy every time I hear these complaints about migrants coming here. It's like, well then, where the hell were you when the United States was destroying Nicaragua? But of course, we in the United States like to hide behind ignorance and say, oh, well, we didn't know. We didn't know that was happening. Which leads many people around the world to say, what are you guys, stupid? Are you fools? Or did you know what you wanted to know? So I'm going to have to say hasta la vista because I have to run and give another presentation right now. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to this. I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much for sparing your night, especially since you had another engagement. I know that this is pretty tiring. So but thank you. That was really amazing. And you know, if there's people who have questions, can we share your email with them if they want to follow up with you? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Bill.
Okay.
You know, we'll look for you again.
Okay.
So,
Very good. Y'all take care.
Thanks, Bill.
thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye now.
Okay, so it's me now, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, before you go, I was
Sure.
hoping that there's some names and faces that I don't recognize, and I apologize if you've come before, and I just don't. It's just on me that I don't recognize you. But if you're new, or if you could please share your email address, either you can do it in the main chat channel, or you can just send it to me, so that we know who you are, and maybe we can reach out to you and you know, include you on our further invites and things that we do here with our revolution.
Or you can introduce yourself now.
Or you can, or if you're brave, you can introduce yourself.
I'm pretty brave. I'm Miguel Buttle. I actually lived in Arlington for about 3 years. A little bit ago, I've been living in Baltimore, and I just moved back end of July. And I plan on making Baltimore my home for the foreseeable future. I'm sorry, Arlington, my home for the foreseeable future. So I'm excited to be back, and even more excited to dig into Arlington politics.
Great, welcome.
Thanks.
Any other newcomers that like to introduce themselves? All right. Who we have here? Sorry, just trying to see what the. Okay. Well, I guess then I'm going to talk. I just wanted to give people an update, assuming that it's of interest to people. But you know, some of us here in our revolution have been working on a campaign. Well, we've had an effort, I should say. It's been going back for about almost maybe a year and a half at this point, where we were looking into how we could bridge the digital divide in Arlington. So we had initially kind of put together an idea that we could maybe create a, well, I should kind of maybe step back and say, give the kind of the history for this. So, hold on, sorry. Oh, whoops. Okay. No, sorry.
So what are you trying to do?
Sorry. I'm thinking of something on my phone, so like
Oh.
everything's everything I have to like, you know, go away from it. Anyway, all right. So basically the backstory on this is this. Arlington has a municipal dark fiber network. Back in like 2010, they used to get their service for the public buildings from Comcast. But then Comcast kind of indicated to them that they were no longer going to give Arlington the sweetheart deal that they had. They were essentially providing almost free service to county buildings like schools, the county offices, community centers, etc. And so once Comcast made that kind of known, they decided to, I don't know whose exact brilliant idea it was, but they decided to build their own municipal network that would provide service to the county buildings, essentially. So that network started being built out in 2012, 2013. I think it finished in 2016. They spent about $4 million on it. Some of it was bonds, some of it was stimulus money. So the network has been very successful in terms of you know, providing service to county or publicly owned buildings. I think they have like 10. I think their speeds are up to like 10 gigs, like symmetrical, and they've saved just a ton of money from that. You know, from not franchising with Comcast anymore. So, and to the network, that part of the network is paid for itself. But what wasn't so successful is that the network was supposed to try to help them earn commercial revenues, and what they never developed a very cohesive strategy for doing that. And they actually formed a committee of experts to look at that. And the committee came out with a number of recommendations that basically said that the county had to do a number of things to make it more attractive if they wanted third parties to lease from this network to start providing private service to their buildings that aren't owned by the county. So what happened in that regard is that they identified that the lease that the county had come up with was too complicated. It runs about like 100 pages, and a normal lease runs maybe like 10. If you compare it to the leasing agreements that other cities have for their dark fiber. And the other thing is that it's a middle mile network, which means there's this kind of big trunk line, but there's nothing, the individual lines that would go to a building, what's called a lateral or last mile network. The county wasn't really offering to build those out otherwise it's a major infrastructure cost for a small company, especially if you're talking about startups that might be providing internet service. So that was kind of where things sat, and the county didn't really make any move on that. So we had actually invited a speaker about 2 years ago, I think, who sat on that advisory committee. Her name was Deb Sersha, and at the time she was the president of Next Century Cities, which is a municipal broadband advocacy group based in DC. And she came and she talked to us about the history of the network and the nature of Comcast, the telecommunications law in Virginia. And she had said that, suggested to us that, that it would make sense for someone maybe just to start their own ISP and do this work. And that kind of got us thinking about what we could maybe do to take advantage of this. And we'd already been looking, part of our group had already been looking at ways to do cooperative business development in South Arlington, where we know that they already have higher than average unemployment, the income levels are lower, longevity, access to healthcare, all the kind of social indicators are very low there. And we also saw that based on the county's own data, the digital divide was pretty stark there. About 10% of households in Arlington right now do not have access to internet at home, but that was before the pandemic hit, so it might be even higher now as people lost jobs and things like that. And basically the people who don't have internet at home generally are earning $75,000 or less, and they're also more likely to be African American or Latinx. So anyway, our idea then had been to kind of create this co-op or a kind of multi-stakeholder cooperative that would build out this network to some of the small businesses along Columbia Pike and to some of the multi-tenant buildings, particularly the ones that are the affordable housing projects, 6 and 8. And so we started off kind of interviewing some people, and we did, thanks to Detta, she did a lot of the surveying, and Jeff Elkner as well, in a lot of the buildings, trying to talk to people and get information on what their current internet situation was like, how much they're paying, what their current choice of service was, and all those kind of things. And we're gathering that data, and we're trying to kind of move forward on it. But then the pandemic hit, and kind of undercut our ability to go and do surveys of the buildings and to do surveys of business owners. And then also we started to see how the pandemic and the lockdown were interacting kind of very lethally, frankly, with the digital divide, because as all of life was kind of shifting online, people who don't have access were really kind of left at a major disadvantage. They're not able to access information to the internet. I mean, they're not able to access information that can protect them, that can help them find a new job if they lost a job, that they find access to services, to talk to a doctor when telehealth was becoming more and more prominent. So, all that seemed like a major crisis to us. And then also like the schools were moving online as well. And we know that there's, obviously with the digital divide, there's a lot of families that just don't have access at home. So at that point, looking at all these factors, we decided that the broadband cooperative would just have to be kind of shelved. And what we decided to propose instead was that the county form its own municipal provider. And so the background on this is that in Virginia, it has a very strange telecom law that basically there's two laws. One is that the county right now has a municipal provider that provides donated county buildings, and that's allowed under the law. But if they wanted to use that network to provide internet service to private entities, like to homes or to businesses or to multi-tenant buildings, then it could do one of two things. And one is that it could get a certificate from the State Corporation Commission to become what's called a local municipal exchange carrier. And if it does that, then it's subject to a lot of unfair rules that the telecom lobbies have put in place. And these are a number of things that they can't. It restricts the kind of services that can be provided, the cost that you can charge for the services. You have to impute all kinds of phantom costs that the private providers are supposedly forced to take on. You can't subsidize. You can't do cross subsidies of services. A number of things that the telecoms themselves actually do, but if the municipal provider was to do, it makes them competitive, so that they've imposed these kind of restrictions. So that's one way to do municipal broadband in Virginia. The other way to do it is to form what's called a wireless service authority. And the wireless service authority will let you basically do everything except for provide television cable service. But you can provide internet directly to private subscribers. And so there's a number of cities and counties in Virginia that have already done this. One is the Eastern Shore of Virginia Broadband Authority, which is Accomack and Northampton counties. Another one is the Roanoke Valley Broadband Authority. And that there's 4 entities there, 2 cities and 2 counties, whose names are escaping me right now. But these are all networks that have formed municipal, publicly owned, open access networks that are providing, the case of the Eastern Shore, they're providing service directly to homes, and they're building out fiber to the home networks, in very rural areas where there's not many people, or it's not even very profitable. It's not profitable at all for them. I mean, but they do have profits, but they're not doing that work for profit, basically. So we know that this can be done based on that, based on the living examples of Roanoke and Eastern Shore. So what we decided is that we're proposing that the county, in turn, form a broadband authority and use that as a vehicle for building out a network to, first you're starting off with the areas that we know that there's a digital divide, and then basically going from there and just building out to the entire county, because right now in Arlington you basically have a choice between, if you're lucky, 2 internet service providers, which is Verizon or Comcast. Verizon, you can get Fios. Comcast, you cannot have they don't have a fiber. They're using coaxial to provide service. So this would be a kind of more of a long-term solution, like mid to long-term solution to the problem. But right now, the county, in order to bridge the digital divide, is now being forced to pay Comcast about $500,000 of CARES Act money to subsidize internet essentials internet service, which is a kind of low-income option that they already had previously, but that was not very well advertised. And right now, so they're trying to hook up about, I think, 4,000 something families in Arlington, but the speeds that they're offering at is only 25 megabits down and 3 up, which is probably not enough to do streaming if there's a lot of kids in the family, plus the parents that are trying to stream at home. That's probably not adequate. And they're apparently being very slow in rolling it out. And on top of that, not every household has a physical connection to Comcast, so for those families, they're giving them a portable Wi-Fi device. They call it a MiFi. And there's apparently, according to APS Director of Technology, can only support streaming for about 2 hours, which obviously is not very adequate for, for the use of, doing digital learning at home. So, looking at all these kind of factors, for us, it just makes no sense to try to just, get rid of these guys entirely and give a public option to the entire county. But, starting with the people who need it the most, and there's plenty of options for them to do kind of vary once they have established an authority, which is fairly reasonably quickly. If they moved quickly and did it, by, next month, for instance, like they could get it set up in about 6 months, and there's options for non-wired connections that they can provide to buildings. So anyway, all this is to say is that we've launched a campaign, and we have a petition and that people can sign. I can drop it in the chat, but we're also having we held a forum with the Arlington Dems back in August that was very successful. We had a number of experts speaking about these issues nationally, locally, and in Virginia. So we have a meeting with the county board coming up this Wednesday with Libby, who's the chair of the county board, Libby Garvey, and Kate Crystal, who's been big into looking at the digital divide issue. She's also on the board, and then their deputy attorney. So we'll see where things go, but we're going to keep pushing this as an issue. And if people are interested in getting involved, certainly, send me a message here privately, or email us at our regular, you can email us at arlfiber, ARLFIBER, at tutanota.com, TUTA.NOTA.com. So I don't know if anyone has questions on that, but if not, that's the end of my long monologue.
Tim, maybe you want to put those emails in the chat. On your phone. Well, he does that just as I did watch the forum, and I just thought it was really interesting how much cheaper. That they had some speakers that had from places that had the municipal broadband, and it was like shockingly cheap, like $10 or $15 a month for very high speed broadband versus what they were paying previously was like $50 or so. So pretty like huge decrease in cost for the end user.
Yeah, I mean exactly, like the county could, if it formed a broadband authority, it could provide service itself, which would be fine. I think it could offer a speed and cost that would be far lower than what's being charged right now by the incumbent telecoms. But it could also, if it doesn't want to provide service itself, which I think that they would be it sounds like they're somewhat averse to that. The other model they could do is there's a city in Idaho called Ammon that has a municipal network, and the way they did it is they built out the network to everyone in the city that wanted it, and then from there they're using software to kind of create this virtual network where, you know, they have multiple private ISPs competing virtually to provide service. And like in that scenario, what you would have is like one set of wires coming into your house, but then, you know, if you want to look for internet service, you pull up a portal. It just gives you a chance to choose, you know, instantly from whatever provider you want. There's no contracts. There's no, you know, you just switch. Like there's nothing to it. And because you have so many providers vying to provide service, like, yeah, they're providing symmetrical gig for like $10 a month, you know, which is just an amazing speed. Like, and there's no caps, like no, you know, it's net neutrality. They're not throttling your Netflix or something like that. So, you know, whatever way that they would want to do it, like you know, either of those options would be good, in my opinion. It would give everyone better service, frankly. So, all right. If no one has any questions, I think, do we have Michelle here?
Yeah, she's there.
I'm here.
Hey, all right. So we invited Michelle Woolley to come to the meeting tonight. She's attended past meetings to talk to us about the police reform and also about repeal of right to work. Both of two initiatives she's very kind of deeply involved in. So we'd asked her if she'd come and maybe just give us an update on both of them, since they're both kind of churning right now at the state level, and I mean, and locally as well.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. So I guess I'll start off with repeal of right to work. So I'm chair and co-founder of the Coalition to Repeal Right to Work, which you guys are a part of, along with like 49 other organizations. And so right now everything is kind of crazy because the special session for the General Assembly has gone on so long, and I think it's going to go on through the end of September. So no one's really started. I don't think our delegates and state senators are really ready to start thinking about 2021 yet, but we've already started having folks reach out to their delegates and state and senators to ask them to support repeal. I don't have, you know, I haven't confirmed yet. I need to reach out to Lee Carter as soon as the special is over and ask him if I'm assuming he'll plan to carry it again this year, because he's carried it the last, I think since 2018, at least since 2018. So yeah, we expect that to go forward. I think it'll still be a battle to get it through the House, but we should have the votes to at least get it out of the House if I think if our delegates are feeling the fire. And if we were to get it out of the House, quite frankly, I think that would be, I mean, obviously passage is the biggest thing we'd want, but and are aiming for, but it would be really, really big deal to be able to get it even that far, and I think would really put the pressure on our Senate. So that's our big goal, is to just be reaching out to your electeds, tell them this is important. We have on our Coalition to Repeal Right to Work Facebook page, we put up, I think last week, I was like on vacation while this was all happening. We put out the info and like the draft letters and whatever it is through Action Network to send. So if you haven't contacted our local folks, I think all of our people locally have been on record as they're supposedly support it, but they haven't necessarily co-patroned it in the past. And so sometimes they're reluctant to actually want to vote on it. So I think it's important to hear from us. Let's see. Okay, so that's kind of repeal right to work. Keep listening for that. I think there'll be more going on. On the police reform front, so I am one of the co-founders on the steering committee of Arlington for Justice locally. And then I've also, people probably don't know this, but I'm also working for Justice Forward Virginia on the statewide stuff. I'm the managing director now. So locally, I'm going to start with on Arlington on our police reform efforts. It's really important right now. We're trying to get this police chief, Chief Farr is retiring. I can't remember when his date, it's supposed to, I think it got moved to, it's like the end of September that he's going to retiring, but I think he might be sticking around to kind of advise or something. I'm not quite clear on that, but he's no longer officially chief. Or I guess Andy Penn is now acting chief. So, or about to be acting chief. And so we're really pushing to have this national search for the replacement with somebody who's very, with a police chief that is, reform minded. I think this is going to be kind of an interesting thing because I don't think there's a lot of those that exist, or it's kind of hard to show. I think we need to have some outside the box thinking on this search, but we're still working. We have meetings. We're trying to set up more meetings with county folks and keep talking to them and pushing them. Our big things are we want to make sure that there's a lot of community involvement and that the county actually follows up on what the community says, because sometimes they go out, they ask for community feedback, and then they don't do what the community has been pushing for, or they listen to certain people. And obviously we know that police interactions, police behavior impacts certain people, and they're not always the people that show up to the public meetings and are the loudest in our community. So we're trying to make sure that they're definitely reaching out to different people and having those conversations. And then we continue to hold the county accountable on this search. So that's kind of the big thing there. There's also the police practices group has been meeting, and there's 15 community members from different organizations that are part of that. They're having, some of their meetings are still, I think most of the meetings are still closed, but some of them are public. They had one tonight on mental health and policing, I think, and they record, like for the public ones, you can go back and watch them later. And I would really be encouraging people to kind of try to stay up to date and be following that. I know that they're giving folks a lot of information right now. It's not exactly clear what's going to have to come out of that police practices group, but they're supposed to be, reviewing assorted police policies and practices. And hopefully that ultimately results in some recommendations and some push for like, here's what we need to do. Here's some specific things on reform. So we'll just kind of see how that goes. On the state level, so there's a lot going on. So they've gotten like the bills, like they're doing like crossover now. It's not like kind of official crossover because it's not a drop dead date, but they're crossing over from the stuff the House passed is going to the Senate, and the stuff the Senate passed is going to the House. And so some of the big excitement there is that pretextual policing bills passed in both the Senate and the House to reduce, police can't just pull you over because of marijuana odor, defective equipment, that sort of thing. That I think is just going to be hugely impactful in terms of limiting the numbers of people, Black people, people of color that are being pulled over by the police, and limiting those interactions. When Philando Castile and Sandra Bland were pulled over, it was because of it was pretext that they were pulled over. It was pretextual reasons. So just to give you kind of like the context of what that means. So that's really good. The House bill that Delegate Patrick Hope, he was the chief patron of, that was actually the better bill of the two. And so we're hoping that one, when they shake out, that ends up being the one, but they're both great bills. So that's happening. We're actually Justice Ford's about to put out an action alert. There's two other big bills that are going into the House that the Senate passed, one on jury sentencing and one on assault on a law enforcement officer. If a law enforcement officer is actually injured by somebody, there are a whole variety of ways in which they can be charged. Like if they're seriously injured, but the assault on the law enforcement officer statute, the way it works is if somebody, like say you have a disability and you have this interaction, you're having a mental mental issue, or like you're just somebody normal and you're getting handcuffed and you kind of flail in the process of getting tackled and handcuffed. If you just like bump the police officer, like don't even really bruise them, you can be charged with assault on a law enforcement officer. And that just seems kind of insane. And it's a felony offense, with mandatory minimum and all of that. So that's gone through the Senate. We need the House to pass it. It's a little bit unclear where the House is on this right now. So we're going to be encouraging people to reach out to their members of the House of Delegates to ask their delegates to support that, support the assault on a law enforcement officer legislation. And then there's this other thing, it's jury sentencing. It's a little bit of a niche issue, but basically what it boils down to is guaranteeing that, like the way in Virginia, this is a weird thing that works, but like juries, like if a jury sentences you, there's like some different sentencing guidelines and stuff than what like a judge would have. A judge can be a little bit more flexible, and prosecutors use that to kind of pressure defendants from getting their jury, like to plead to things, because and push them out of going for their jury and being able to have their constitutional right to a jury trial. So this could actually really impact a lot of people. The Virginia Association of Commonwealth Attorneys is trying to say it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's just not. We don't have that many jury trials already in Virginia, and I don't think it's going to lead to a big uptick. It's just going to end like their ability to kind of pressure people based on that, and just kind of like enshrine a constitutional, like, you know, make sure people are actually getting that access to their constitutional right. Parissa supports it. Not a lot of other Commonwealth attorneys do, but she does support it. And a lot of the criminal justice reform community. So that's a big one. We're actually going to be asking people to make sure the House passes it. Elsewise, there is civilian review board stuff has gone through. The big omnibus civilian package went through. There's some expungent stuff and earned sentence credits that's working its way through the Senate. And there's something I'm forgetting, and I don't remember what it is. Anyways, those are the things. I think everybody got really, obviously, I think everybody was paying attention last week when, or not everybody, but I should say a lot of people that are following criminal justice issues. I think we're following the qualified immunity that got killed last week. You know, obviously, like I think we need to address that. I think a lot of this stuff, I don't think people should be totally, I mean, we'd want more out of our General Assembly than what we've been getting ideally. But I think there's also been some really good stuff that's come out of this special session. And I think people they're queuing up better things to come out in the regular session. And so I just think, I think the qualified immunity is going to come back, or they're going to come back and have a bigger discussion about that. There is support on the Republican side as well. Like there's bipartisan support, but I think they just gotta work through it a little bit more and have a bigger conversation about that. And I think there's some other issues that there's gonna be, or some things that they kind of just only tepidly address this session, and that they, like when they have a little bit more time or they get some feedback or cover or whatever in 2021, that they'll do a little bit more work on. I think some people get down on the General Assembly, and I know that they're not as progressive as we'd always like them to be. But I also remind people, I'm like, this is Virginia. It's like the heart of the we had the capital of the Confederacy, and I'm like, we're really making strides here in a relatively short period of time in the last couple of years. So I'm like very optimistic about some of the changes that we're going to be able to make going into 2021. So yeah, I think this session is going to end up being, I mean, if the pretext stuff ends up fine, that should be pretty good to go. There's some other things that are going to come out. The civilian review boards are going to be great because there's going to be there's been a question about subpoena power for localities, and that's going to make sure that they have subpoena power. And that's huge, right? Like that's a huge hurdle for us locally in pushing it, because when we talk to our local electeds about it, well, like, I don't even know if we can have subpoena power. Like nobody seems to know the answer to this question, and that'll resolve it. So then that makes it, as advocates, we can be like, no, you need, like, okay, we've got this, let's do it. So that's it. Yeah. Anything else? I know I went through that all really, really rapidly. I'm kind of hyped up on caffeine today. So.
Michelle, I have one quick question.
Yes.
You mentioned the hiring the new police chief for Arlington.
Mm-hmm.
Who actually hires the police chief? Is that the county manager directly?
It's the county manager hires. And in the past, my understanding is that the county boards had some kind of like input on it, like more official input, not just like political kind of pushing or whatever. Right. But I think that it's Mark Schwartz, and I don't know exactly if we want them to have more input, but it's Mark Schwartz does the hiring. So
does the board have to approve it or anything?
Mm-mm. He just makes the hire. So
interesting.
So Michelle, what I'm wondering is, I mean, it always frustrates me. I love living in Northern Virginia, but it also frustrates me because the people I really want to lobby are not the legislators in Northern Virginia, right? So are there any issues that we do need to reach and lobby our own representatives right here, that they're maybe not as progressive as we want them to be?
So I would actually say, so I think it's kind of somewhat deceptive just because our legislators are generally better than some other areas. I actually think, I've talked to Alfonso about right to work, and he's and like that kind, and I think they're all on board. I think our senators all need some pushing and to really feel the push on that, and that this is important to us. Okay. Even though they've said, like in theory, that I don't think Janet Howell has said she supports it. But even though they in theory say that they like support it, like they don't necessarily go to bat for it. So I think that that's really important.
Okay.
On the criminal justice reform issues, like they all need to be, I think, I would say almost uniformly, like there's not, like they all have different issues, right? That they're like not great on or that they need convincing on, but I think they actually all need to be hearing from us. And I will be honest, somebody that represents part of a neighboring jurisdiction very close to us and who is in House leadership, very high House leadership, is actually not always good on these issues.
No.
Which is, and it's a problem. So she's been great this session. She's been good this session, but I'm saying like has not always been great on this stuff. So
Right. So you're talking, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's somebody else, but you're talking about Saslow?
well, no, we all know he's not good, but there's a woman,
Okay.
a woman that represents part of Alexandria.
Oh, why don't you say
in the House of Delegates? It's Charnel Herring. So she's been really great this
Interesting.
session, but she hasn't always been good. And she's chair of the House of the Courts of Justice Committee in the House of Delegates.
Right.
And so she's been really good this session, but I think she's just more conservative by nature. She's not been a criminal justice. She hasn't done like criminal, she's just an attorney, but not a criminal defense attorney. And so I think she has always needed to hear from people. So I just to say that like, I think actually our delegates in Northern Virginia, we shouldn't be assuming that they're all super.
Okay.
I have found Mark Levine is almost always on board with my stuff. I'm like part of like his one little section in Arlington that he represents, but the others have all needed conversations on different things. So yeah.
So, I mean, maybe we can do this some other, but if we could identify which, I mean, if you think you've got a list of things that we should, lobby them all on, then let me know. Or if you think we should hit certain people on certain things, let me know, and maybe we can do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, from Justice Forwards, like for right now, for this week, we're just focused on this jury sentencing, and I can send you this stuff once we get our action alert up. I can send it to Tim and
Okay, that
you
sounds
guys
good.
can send it out. But like the jury sentencing and this assault on the law, I think the assault on the law enforcement officer, I think all of them need to hear from us on that. I think the jury sentencing, Rip was on, I know a panel with some other Arlington delegates, I don't know, some kind of panel that happened tonight. And he seemed to think that the jury sentencing is going to go, like that's in good shape, but I don't know about the assault on the law enforcement officer. I think they get a lot of heat on that from the police officer groups, and a lot of like, it's just, yeah, more controversial. Jury sentencing is kind of niche, so they don't get as much heat on that.
So I mean, I think we'd be happy to share that information within this group, and then, we can share it outside this group, and I can share it with the NAACP, and maybe we can make some action items, So,
Wonderful.
yes.
Yeah. I'll send that out. I'm hoping to get it. I need to do it tonight or tomorrow morning still. So I've been working with our leadership team on that. So but I'll send that around for sure. And that would be great if you guys would they just need to make sure they know. And even if they're good on it, I have found that often they just want to make sure that they're hearing, they hear from the other side, and it's better if they can say like, oh, we have been hearing from constituents and it's overwhelmingly in support of this, so. Awesome. Anything else?
Any other questions? Speak now.
Yes,
All right,
I gotta go to work.
Thank you so much. We won't keep you, since it sounds like you have work to do. So.
All day. It's been insane. But thank you so much for having me. This was great, and I'll send this stuff around. So thanks for inviting me, Tim.
Great. Thank you so much for your work.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, guys.
So I think
Brings us to the end, I think.
I think we're kind of at the end. I guess this is kind of the de facto open forum. So if anybody has something to share, feel free to do so right now.
So I don't have anything to share, but I just wanted to say, Tim, if you have anything in particular you want the people who are going with you to the meeting on Wednesday, if you want us to say particular things, maybe we should have a pre-meeting or something.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest that. I was gonna try to send Well, maybe I should do it tonight, actually. But I wanted to send an email at least just to kind of. I have some thoughts on it. I mean, basically, I think we have two different groups. The citizen groups. So it's Kathy Scruggs, her group of like educators, and then the RL Fiber people, and then we'll have some experts from Eastern Shore there as well. And Josh Farah from ITAC also will be there. So I guess we really need to think kind of what we're going to, whether we need to. We only have an hour, which is not much time,
No,
obviously.
so there might be
So I
just some benefit to having all these different people representing different things. I think Kathy Scruggs is really good to have on this.
Yeah, no,
And just
she would be great. Yeah, and so I think it's
Yeah,
just going to
that's
be, I think it's going to be maybe just like, a couple of key people, maybe just a couple of minutes, just to put something out there, and then we'll just,
Okay.
get their reaction and see how it's going to go. But yeah, but thanks for reminding me. I definitely need to send something out on it.
So as long as I'm saying something, let me just say, if anyone wants to do voter registration, we've got lots of voter registration going on in Arlington right now. And, there's voter registration with the Dems, which is always nonpartisan anyway. There's voter registration with the NAACP, which has got to be nonpartisan. And we're just having, it got started late, so we're having 2 or 3 events a day. So if anybody wants to participate, just email me.
Great. Could you put your email in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay. How are you doing those voter registrations? Like you're outside, take it? Just catching people in the street, or?
Yes. Well, I usually do NAACP voter registration, and we like to do affordable housing because them usually used to cover the metro corridor very, very well. It was getting all of the people that moved in and out and everything, and they're high volume and everything, but nobody was really covering affordable housing very well. So we've been doing that. And I've been doing this for years, right? So it's kind of interesting because usually it's just like onesies and twosies, and we do voter education at the same time. We hand out all sorts of important information, citizenship information, all this. This year, I've really noticed that people really want to vote. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like we're getting 20 per time or anything, but it's picked up. It really has picked up a lot. So we do affordable housing. We're going to start doing the library at certain times, and just a few like pop-up things, but mostly it's affordable housing. And then the Dems are going to well, they've got Latino and Black caucuses now, and so Latino caucus is doing a lot of work near the Mega Mart on Columbia Pike, and they've been doing lots of Spanish-speaking voter registration. Oh, and how we're doing it? I'm sorry, that's what you asked, right? We've got a table full of information. We've got masks on. We've got hand sanitizer. We've got QR codes if people want to do it on their phone. We try to stay away, 6 feet away from people. They always, I think 4 feet is the new 6 feet. I just don't know why people can't measure that, but they're just always coming in a little too close. But we thought that people would not want to use paper, but they almost always use paper. And, they have hand sanitizer. They can sanitize their hands after they touch the pens, or they can sanitize the pens or whatever they want to sanitize, but they almost always want to use paper. So, we answer their questions and help them and give them information.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Great. Well, thanks for your work. Anyone else have anything to share? Well, all right. Well, if no one has anything to share, you know, you know what we're up to. So if you want to get involved, or if you have, I guess the one thing I would mention is that I've been talking with a few other people who are delegates to the Virginia Democratic Party convention about potentially starting a housing campaign that would be modeled on the homes guarantee that, you know, some delegates in the House have picked up on, like AOC and Ilhan Omar, and it formed kind of the basis of both, you know, parts of Bernie and Elizabeth Warren's campaigns, but, you know, somewhat more distilled down to Virginia level. So if people are interested in housing issues, please, you know, get in touch with me. You know, we'd like to have some help. We're working on creating a yard sign and coming up with a kind of manifesto, but and we'll actually have a meeting with somebody from the Homes Guarantee National so sometime soon to kind of talk about becoming a official affiliate for Virginia. So that's another thing that's in the works. If anyone's interested in that, let me know. But if that's it, then I guess we can call the meeting to close. Dan?
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.